Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to give you all just about 60 seconds here to trickle in. Thank you for joining. Thank you, everyone. We're about to get started in just a few seconds here. All right. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Whole Grain Food Processing and the Limitations of the NOVA Classification System. So here are our learning objectives for today. And we're going to have a poll at the end. So these are things I want you to pay especially close attention to. We are recording this session. You will receive an email within a week with the CPEU certificate, the slides, and the video recording. Hopefully we'll get to send it out by the end of this week, but if not, next week you'll receive it. Hopefully we'll have time for a question and answer with our presenter. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom, just so that your questions don't get lost in the chat. And whether you are joining us live or you're watching the recording, please stay tuned throughout the whole webinar. We'll have an interactive assessment at the end where you can quiz yourself on what you learned. So please do participate in that. And finally, these are our disclosures. There was no commercial support or funding provided for this webinar. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to our lovely speaker today, Elissa Price. Elissa, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Kelly. Hello. I saw everyone saying hello from their various locations in the chat. I'm coming from Australia, and I want to say it's this morning here, so it's almost or just past 7 a.m. Here today. I'll just check. I don't think I. Okay, I think my screen is sharing. Okay,
Yes,
there.
we can see your slides.
Okay, thanks so much, Kelly. All right, we will get started. And as Kelly mentioned, the topic of my webinar that I'm running today is understanding whole grain food processing and the limitations of the NOVA classification system. So this has been a large part of my PhD research that I've been completing for the last 3 years, and I hopefully will be finished by the end of this year, which is very exciting. So here in Australia, I'm an accredited practicing dietitian. So alongside my research, I also do a bit of clinical work in private practice, working with chronic disease management and lifestyle management. So a lot of things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and so forth, which I love just as equally with research. So my next slide is just looking at our learning outcomes again that Kelly's already mentioned, but I'll briefly run through them. So the aim is to correctly identify whole grain foods considered as ultra processed using the NOVA system, evaluate ultra processed foods relationship with overall diet quality, and describe how whole grains are processed and how this processing impacts accessibility and diet quality. So we will start with kind of the basics today and build from there, because I'm sure a lot of you who have joined know what a whole grain is. But so a whole grain, as we know, has our 3 edible components still intact. So that's the bran, endosperm, and the germ. And the bran and the germ are those 2 parts of the grain that are really nutrient dense. So we have that outer layer, that's the bran, that's filled with a lot of B vitamins, fiber, and minerals. We've also got the germ that's filled with a lot of B vitamins as well, but also things like vitamin E and healthy fats. whereas our refined grain only has that middle endosperm section of the grain left. And there's still some proteins and vitamins there, but not in the concentrations that we would have in a whole grain. So our whole grain content in foods can differ, or it can vary. So what I've got on the slide here is that we can start on the left, or the left end of the spectrum, where we have the grain itself. And in this example, it's a wheat grain. We can then move forward and produce bread. So we've then got a refined grain bread, obviously doesn't have any whole grain content in it. From there, we can have something like a multi-grain bread, for example, where it's still made using refined grain flour, but they've added some grains and potentially whole grains in there as well. So we've slightly increased the content. And then we get to that last bread on the right-hand side there, which is a wholemeal or a whole wheat bread, where it's usually close to 100% whole grain containing. So yeah, I guess the idea of this slide is just to demonstrate that we can have whole grain foods, but they can vary in their whole grain content as well. And when we are talking about these foods, we do want to try and aim for those ones that have the highest content that we can get to get those health benefits. So we've had some work done by the Whole Grain Initiative, and they identified or defined what a whole grain food actually is based on those varying contents. So they've summarized that a whole grain food must contain at least 50% of whole grain ingredients based on dry weight. And they also identified some front of pack labeling requirements as well, where the percentage just changes down a little bit to 25%. So once we've got 25% whole grain containing based on the dry weight of the food, we can have a front of pack labeling based on this scheme. And then, yeah, we define the whole grain food as 50% whole grain containing. So why are we interested in whole grains? Well, we know that when we consume more whole grains, we reduce our risk of things like cardiovascular disease, total cancer, mortality from all causes, type 2 diabetes, colon cancer. And we had another study completed that shows a diet that's low in whole grains, when we're looking at the number of deaths attributable to diet, a diet low in whole grains is actually the second largest contributor. And when we're talking about cardiovascular disease, it's our largest contributor there. So there's a lot that we've still got a lot of a way to go with whole grains, but the health benefits that they show are, yeah, substantial. So, based on that, we have our dietary guidelines, and I will today probably talk mostly about Australia and the US, obviously because I'm coming from Australia, and our webinar is predominantly based in the US, but it's also the work that I've been focusing on is the two national dietary data sets between the two countries. So it's what I'm most familiar with as well, I guess. So we know whole grains are good for us, and we know our national dietary guidelines provide evidence-based recommendations. So it's not surprising that in our Australian dietary guidelines, they recommend to enjoy a wide variety of nutritious foods from our 5 core food groups. One of those core food groups being grain foods, and further suggests to consume mostly whole grain or high cereal fiber varieties. In the US, also not surprising, they describe a healthy dietary pattern to include whole grains, and recommend that at least half of our total grain intake, should be that of whole grains. So it's recommended within our dietary guidelines, but how do we predominantly consume these foods? So my next slide here is looking at, well, what are our primary sources of whole grain intake globally? And this was a systematic or a scoping review, that I ran last year. And the idea was to identify these foods and so that we can kind of capitalize them and promote whole grain intake based on what we're familiar with. And so forth. So what we found were that in our Western countries, like Northern American countries, Europe and Australia and New Zealand, our primary food sources of whole grain are ready-to-eat cereals, as well as breads and bread rolls. And then we can see on the slide there as well that this differs in parts of, well, like Latin America, we have more corn-based products, so more like fresh corn and corn chips. And then in Asian countries like South Korea, their intakes are predominantly from things like brown rice. So how do we get these whole grain foods to us? How do we grow, process, produce these foods? My next slide is looking at the overall kind of supply chain of whole grain foods. So the first section there is looking at, well, we grow them, farmers grow them, we store them, we then clean them, we then process these grains into foods, we then send them to the grocery store, and then we end up with these foods at our home for consumption. When we're talking about the processing of grains and whole grain food, we're looking predominantly at point 3 and 4 there, which is the cleaning of the grains as well as the production of whole grain foods. So getting more into the processing side of things now, how do we, or why do we process whole grains? Which we're starting more at point 3 to get started, so more at that ingredient level. The first point there is to increase the nutritional value and the edibility of the grain. So I mentioned earlier that the edible part of a whole grain has those 3 main components still intact. But when we grow the whole grain, it's also got a 4th kind of outer layer, which is the hull. And we actually need to process grains to remove that outer layer so that we can access the nutrients that are on the inside of the grain. So for example, we've got dehulling and cutting, so oat into steel cut oats, or we've got dehulling and polishing, so things like brown rice to make it a little bit shinier and nicer to look at. We also have processing of whole grains to improve the ease of preparation, so to reduce cooking time. A couple of different methods include things like parboiling, so partially boiling the grain or steaming it and then drying it. So we've produced a more porous grain. So once it gets to our homes or the kitchen, that the cooking time is significantly reduced there. We have rolling, flaking, or flattening of grains, and an example of that is something like rolled oats. So we've increased the surface area of the grain. And when we do cook it then in something like water, the liquid can be absorbed faster based on that surface area. We then have cracking or grinding, so things like cracked wheat, and we've just simply cut it down into smaller particles so it will cook easier there or quicker there as well. We also process whole grains to increase the diversity of preparation. So something like milling into flour, we then can use that flour in a variety of different foods, from things, the obvious one being bread, I guess, but then things like baked goods and things like that as well. We're then kind of shifting between point 3 and 4 that we were looking at before, but we also process whole grains we can prevent cooking entirely. So processes like puffing or extrusion. So for puffing, we have high heat and pressure applied and it puffs the grains. So something like puffed Wheaties. And then we have extrusion where we've got high heat and high pressure applied to mold it into a specific shape. So something more like Cheerios, for example. So when we process grains, we end up with, and I'm kind of a broken record here, but we have a very extent of whole grain processing. So we can process something and still have predominantly that ingredient or grain kind of, you can see it still, so something like oats, but then we have further processing where we've used those ingredients to produce something like a whole grain food, and bread's just the obvious example that I've included there as well. So how do we process whole grain foods? I have a bit of a handout here from the Australian Food and Grocery Council, and they've developed these very cool resources to kind of explain to consumers how we produce these breads and to make consumers more familiar with the process of processing whole grains and developing whole grain foods, I guess. So that first point there is what we've kind of covered. We can mill grains down into a flour. We've then got fortification there, which is specific to Australia in this case. So I think in the US, fortification or enrichment of grains is for refined grains only, but in Australia, we have mandatory fortification of thiamine and folic acid in our bread making flour. And then when we make the dough in Australia, we also required to use iodized salt. So it's fortified with iodine there as well. And in the making of that dough, we might also have some added ingredients like emulsifiers or so forth to help in the dough development, but also to help with the shelf stability of the end product. We then mix it, allow the proteins to develop. We then proof it, allow it to sit and the dough to rise. And then, of course, we bake and cool and slice and package and sell it at the grocery store. Another quick example we have there as well from, again, from the Australian Food and Grocery Council is how a muesli bar is made. So in this case, I've used the example of oats as well as some wheat, blend it together. Again, usually in that blending process, we might have some form of additives in there as well. Press it in the pan, can optionally decorate it, allow it to cool, cut it, package it, and then of course it's going to the grocery store to be sold. So my next slide is a little bit of a summary. And I was hoping if it all goes well, we can use the chat function to kind of make a summary slide about why we process whole grains. And of course, I've mentioned a few of the reasons already, but I was hoping to see if we could come up with some extra ones as well. So yeah, go for it. If you've got some ideas or something to contribute, please use the chat. Yes, I can see some great ones coming through as well. So we've got things like storage time, making them edible, texture, increasing the nutritional value, texture again. Yeah, to make different products so we can get a variety of whole grain products and keep them nice and interesting. Great, make them easier to eat, reduce cooking time. Perfect. So there's lots of great suggestions coming through there. And yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. So my first one there was the removal of the inedible components. So like the hull so that we can access those nutrients. So we make them edible, as you guys said, to produce foods that deliver these nutrients. So things like fiber and healthy fats, to improve preparation and cooking times and increase the accessibility to whole grains. And then I've got in Australia there as well, we've got fortification too. And then I think the very first person might have mentioned shelf life or shelf stability. And then we also have sensory improvements as well, where someone I think mentioned palatability, for example. So that takes us to kind of another dimension of food processing or the processing of whole grains for functionality and acceptance. So as I mentioned in those diagrams, we have, for example, the addition of emulsifiers, and this is to decrease spoilage and increase the loaf volume as well. We also have the addition of mold inhibitors. So our whole wheat breads retain often moisture or have a higher moisture content. So they can be occasionally susceptible to mold or faster spoilage, I guess. And then we also have palatability measures, for example, like added sugars and enhancing the sensory property of the whole grain food. But the question we ask here, and I don't have the answer, but it's just something to think about. And it obviously would entirely depend on the amount of added sugar we have in the product, but does something like that outweigh the whole grain benefits or the benefits that the whole grains within the food product might provide for us? So that brings me to the NOVA classification system. So we've got a wide variety of processing of whole grain foods, and then obviously foods more broadly as well. So the NOVA classification system was developed, I think, originally in 2009, and it's been updated over the years as well. And they've attempted to categorize foods based on the nature, extent, of their processing. So they've developed 4 groups, the first one being unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And essentially that means the only kind of level of processing these foods have undergone is the removal of that inedible component, and there's no additional like substances added to the foods. So I've circled there as well. We can see, for example, grains, and that makes sense based on kind of what we've said. Group 2 there is processed culinary ingredients. So they might be substances that are derived from group 1 foods or from nature, and like undergone very minor processing. So for example, pressing, milling, or grinding, and they don't have any they haven't alluded to any grains or flours in that section, but something like a wholemeal flour, for example, might fall into group 2. We then have group 3, which is processed foods, and that's processing of foods from group 1 or 2 with the addition of some things like oil, salt, or sugar, or any kind of add to the meal that you would find in your home kitchen, and they're accessible that way. And we've got there, for example, artisanal bread or homemade bread might fall into that section too. And then the last group we have there, which is obviously the hot topic, is ultra processed foods. And they're no longer describing them as foods, but rather formulations that are made from a series of processes like extraction or chemical modification. And it includes very little ingredients or foods from group 1 that are still intact, for example. So the principles of ultra processed foods, or how do we identify them? What are they? The first one we have there is that they're industrial formulations that contain 5 or more ingredients, or typically contain 5 or more ingredients. They have inclusion of additives such as sugars, oils, fats, salt, antioxidants, stabilizers, and preservatives, as well as additives for sensory improvements, so things like flavors, colors, and sweeteners. As I said earlier as well, for processed foods where the additives are more things that we can find in our kitchen or find at home, these ultra processed foods have ingredients that aren't typically available or accessible at home. So things like hydrolyzed proteins or soy isolates. And then we have industrial processing techniques like extrusion and molding that's not used in home cooking. And as you might recall, I mentioned some of those techniques used for some whole grain foods earlier on as well. And it's therefore based on those principles that some of our whole grain foods have been caught up in that ultra processed food category, and they're not often depicted with all those other ultra processed foods. But yeah, they do unfortunately fall in that category. So it's things like commercial bread, ready to eat cereals, and muesli bars. And this research group has done a lot of work in the past years, looking at or producing evidence that links intake of these ultra processed foods with increased poor health outcomes, like risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so forth. So what is it about these ultra processed foods more broadly that we might be concerned about, or what is it about them that might increase our risk of chronic disease or weight gain, for example, if we do consume them? The short answer is we don't know. There's no conclusive evidence about these foods that link them to poor health outside of kind of like their nutritional quality. There's also been some work done on food texture and eating rate that's going to be really interesting. I think there's still ongoing work with that that might explain it a little bit more. But so far, the associations that we've seen do predominantly seem to be nutrient driven, or driven by the nutritional quality of the food. So things more like sugar sweetened beverages and red or processed meats, which we will have a little bit of a further look at shortly as well. So in the diagram there, as I said, they've hypothesized potentially lower nutritional quality of foods, so increase amounts of salt, sugar, saturated fat, and energy, and decrease amounts of fiber, vitamins, and micronutrients. And this is where the nuances or the caveats start to creep in, because we know our whole grain foods are actually high in fiber and are good sources of things like vitamins and micronutrients. So yeah, they kind of are a little bit of a standout in that broader ultra processed food group, I suppose. We've also got their changes in the food matrix and texture. So things like the impact on digestibility, bioavailability of nutrients, chewing, eating rate, and overconsumption. But again, just flagging that the processing of whole grain foods is essential because we actually increase that digestibility or increase that bioavailability of nutrients. So the other one I'll just point out as well is we've got food additives there at the bottom, but we don't have any conclusive data or solid data on food additives at the moment, at least. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this goes. So my next slide is again a little bit of an interactive one, and hopefully we can get the chat happening again. So I've got a little bit of not a game, but a little bit of a task. I've got some food examples here, just food labels examples, photos that I've taken, and I thought maybe in the chat you could vote or say whether you think that based on those ingredients they might be ultra processed foods or not. So I've got that first one there. We've got 98% cooked rice, vegetable oil, and a stabilizer there as well. They're not ultra processed for most. Yeah, okay. I've got a couple of others, so we will keep going. We've got popping corn, vegetable oil, and sea salt. Not ultra processed. Great. Yeah. So, and I should tell you actually, so yeah, that second one there wouldn't be considered ultra processed. But that first one there would be because it's got a stabilizer there as well, despite being about 98% of a brown rice, of a whole grain. The next one there as well. Yes, yeah, great. So that one would be ultra processed. We've got a couple of different kind of additives or things that we wouldn't be able to access in the kitchen at home in that food product. What about this one here? Ultra processed or not? Yeah, great. Similar to the last one. And this one. No, great. Yeah, we've just got good old oats there. And what about this product here? Do we think it's ultra processed or not? So we've got a bit of a mix there, which is really interesting. This one would be ultra processed because we've got barley malt extract, and I think we can sometimes get something like that in our home kitchen. It's not typical. And the last one here that might be, you guys might hit this one out of the park. I didn't have time to make my own bread, sorry, to take a photo, which might just add to the discussion later on. Okay, great. Yeah, so not ultra processed homemade bread. Yeah. And so my question now is what we've just done as that activity is we've looked at the ingredients of foods to assess whether they are considered ultra processed or to determine their level of processing. So now I guess it's just a point of reflection of with the Nova system or with this approach in general, are we really assessing the level of processing of the food, or are we simply having a look at what types of ingredients are in there? Or are we looking at nutrients, for example? So we're kind of assessing ingredients to determine the level of processing. We don't know, for example, the change in the food matrix of that whole grain wheat cereal that's 97% just because the barley malt extract is added. But yeah, so I guess that's just a limitation to note there as well, is that we're predominantly looking at ingredients to measure processing and yeah, I guess reflecting on the accuracy of that approach. So my next slide is we had quite a combination of responses when we looked at the different foods. And I just wanted to pop this in here as well, because I think a lot of people maybe who have joined today are registered dietitians, but there's been some research done looking at, well, what are the level of understanding of dietitians of whole grains and their processing and the Nova classification system. So this first bit of work was done in Australia, and they kind of summarized that although most dietitians agreed with the classification of these whole grain foods based on the Nova system, they tended to consider whole grain breads and ready-to-eat breakfast cereals as excessively processed food items. We also had another study done with dietitians in the UK, and they were asked similar questions to what I've just asked, to categorize the food based on what they think their level of processing is within Nova. And here we do have an ultra-processed bread. I'm so sorry the picture isn't great, but it does have things like emulsifiers, so it is ultra-processed. But despite that, there was 46% of dietitians in this study that would still consider that bread more of a processed item as opposed to an ultra processed item. So there's a bit of variability in how we consider foods. And my point here as well is that as nutrition health professionals, it's still a little bit tricky for us to understand. So if this is conveyed into messaging for consumers, for example, we're creating, or I'm guessing we're going to be creating a lot more noise for them in terms of their nutrition and food intake. Okay, so I will start to try and move just a little bit faster, sorry, because I'm watching the time as well. But my next slide is looking at, well, as I've said before, there's been links of this ultra processed food intake with poor health outcomes. So just a few, looking a little bit more at my work that I've been doing now, which not this specifically, but so this study was done in Australia looking at ultra processed food consumption and obesity. And as we can see there, high intakes of ultra processed foods was linked with higher BMI across quintiles, as well as higher waist circumference. But we questioned more highly processed whole grains within this ultra processed category actually less healthy. So what we reran the same analysis using the same data, and that's what we can see in approach 1 there. Approach 2, we ran the same analysis, but we excluded foods that were more than 25% whole grain containing from that ultra processed food category. And then approach excluded foods that were more than 50% whole grain containing. And what I've highlighted there is just we then reran the same analysis. So when we've taken those foods away and looked at, does the amount of body weight that is explained by the proportion of energy intake from ultra processed foods change when we do remove those foods? And it doesn't. So we can see that the percentages, or the adjusted R-squared value there, remained unchanged when we remove those foods. And that was telling us that these foods don't necessarily contribute, or might not contribute, to those associations that were shown between ultra processed food intake and obesity. I also ran a very similar or the same analysis in using NHANES data from 2015 to 2018. And I've just got the body weight example there as well. When we remove those foods, the adjusted R-square value remained unchanged as well. We've got some more data as well recently, looking at whether these more highly processed whole grains are less healthy or not. And as we can see here, so this study was looking at the consumption of these foods, of all ultra-processed foods, and risk of multimorbidity of cancer and cardiometabolic diseases. And we can see there that ultra-processed breads and cereals were actually health protective, because that small green bar is completely on the left. So the risk decreased. We have a similar analysis that's looking more at the subgroup level again within the ultra-processed food category. And we can see in terms of risk of type 2 diabetes. And I've zoomed in there as well. When looking at that more closely, we can see that the ultra-processed breads and cereals in their entirety are health protective, as well as ultra-processed cereals and then ultra-processed dark bread and ultra-processed dark breads and whole grain breads are health protective there too. What's interesting, which I've highlighted there in green as well, is that the ultra-processed refined breads actually didn't show that same health protective effect. But we know within Nova, it's put all these breads that are both refined and whole grain within the same category and then doesn't differentiate based on their level of processing, when we know that typically those more refined breads or foods, in general, cereals as well, are more highly processed. So now moving on to diet quality. So why are we seeing these nuances with the ultra-processed food category more broadly, and the whole grain foods not quite fitting in with associations that were previously shown? So this was a meta-analysis that was run, and what we saw was that higher ultra-processed food intake was associated with higher energy intake, total fat, saturated fat, and lower fiber intake. We also saw that there was a reduced intake of various vitamins and minerals. But one that I find interesting on this screen here is that there was no associations found for sodium. But my question to think about here is that, is this really new information for us? We've always known that more highly processed foods are typically not as nutritionally superior or not as nutritionally great for us. So yeah, are we adding anything here new? Are we surprised at anything here? Perhaps not really. So it would also be interesting to have this kind of data at the subgroup level as well, because we know that those associations can change based on that, but we just don't have that available at the moment. When we then look at a diet high in whole grains and diet quality, we then see more a greater nutritionally beneficial diet quality. So, for example, we can see there that higher whole grain intake, we get a higher healthy eating index. We have higher fiber intake, lower added sugar intake. And I will flag as well, obviously, this is quite old data in the US from the early 2000s. But I've also done some work recently, which is hopefully close to submitting for publication, where we were looking at or identified that 70% of the whole grain intake in the US comes from ultra processed sources. And we saw that there was no association with added sugar intake as well. And it's kind of just linking back to that processing for functionality and acceptance slide, where we did flag that sometimes these foods can have some added sugars, for example. Just another quick example, more recent data, still kind of old, done in the UK, higher whole grain intake associated with higher fiber intake, lower added sugar or free sugar intake again as well. So there's just that juxtaposition there, I guess, between looking at ultra processed foods and then looking at whole grain foods and diet quality. So a example in the US then, this study looked at quintiles of ultra processed food intake and then diet quality scoring using the AHA dietary scores. So they found that as ultra processed food intake, there was increased, there was lower scores observed for fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, refined, and then higher scores for things like sugar sweetened beverages, refined grains, and added sugars. There was also a large difference found, or not a large difference, sorry. There was a difference found between high ultra processed food intake and then lower dietary scores for whole grains, but the magnitude of the difference wasn't as large as those food groups highlighted at the top of the slide there. And what I will just say here as well is that 98% of the American or the US population do not meet the daily intake requirement for whole grains, which is 48 grams per day. So we know across the board in the US, unfortunately, we have really low whole grain intake. So it's really probably not surprising here that we see this score as well. So we've got quite the balancing act that we need to do or think about for whole grains in terms of their processing and then looking at their nutrients as well. So I've kind of just tried to summarize it a little bit here, but we know we've got poor whole grain intake at the population level. So that's 98% in the US. In Australia, 73% of our population don't eat enough whole grains. We know we have a better diet quality with higher whole grain intake. We know that processing of whole grains is unavoidable, but actually improves the nutrient bioavailability within the food. We have whole grains, including ultra processed types considered ultra processed by Nova, that have health protective effects. But we do still have to kind of consider what we were talking about previously with things like added sugar. And also we've got things like additives in the food matrix that we have inconclusive data about. But we do have the evidence that despite all that, that those ultra processed types are health protective. So maybe we could, considering everything, prioritize all whole grain foods. Promote all whole grain foods. Maybe we prioritize the lesser processed types, but we definitely shouldn't be discouraging intake at the moment based on the evidence of those more highly processed or ultra processed types. And I wanted to ask the chat of why I might think that way or why that might be. But have a quick just think to yourself, and I will keep moving to explain it just in the interest of time. So yes, why are we not demonizing the ultra processed whole grains? If we go back to that study that we were looking at done in the US, large difference in the associations across quintiles between ultra-processed food intake and diet quality scores were for some more of our vulnerable groups, so minority groups, lower educated individuals, lower household income levels, higher BMI, but also looking further at the data, the underweight category actually had the greatest difference, but they had a lesser population numbers in their quintiles. So yeah, I guess what we're saying here is that we have groups where we need to be a little bit more considerate of kind of what we're saying, what we're recommending. And yeah, if you think about it realistically, if you're talking to like a single mom who has a few children or that kind of thing at home and is making ends meet week to week, we really don't want to be saying, we'll cut ultra processed foods out of your diet, because they realistically might not be left with much food at all at the end of the day. But perhaps here what we need to be focusing more on is that, well, what are the best options within that category that we can be recommending or capitalizing on? And it might be these whole grain varieties that we have been looking at. We also have the British Nutrition Foundation summarised as well, that we need to be considerate of the unintended consequences that limiting ultra-processed foods might have on groups like people with poor access to cooking equipment, people with limited cooking skills, those unable to afford energy and food, and those with busy lifestyles as well. And I guess that's what I was alluding to earlier. I don't have time in my week as much as I would like like to slow down and bake some bread for the week ahead, yes, I didn't have time to do that. So yes, we've also had some work done in Australia as well, because back to that, we fortify our whole grain foods here, that modeled, well, if we take these ultra processed foods out of our diet, there's significant impacts on those fortificants. So there's a reduced intake of folate, thiamine, iron, and iodine there as well. And in Australia, or globally, that's a concern for women age, but in Australia, that's a concern for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as well. A quick couple of next slides are pretty quick, but processing impacts on accessibility. So it improves access to nutrient-dense, low-cost foods, particularly in the case of whole grain foods. So we can see 33% of the top quartile of nutrient-dense, low-cost foods were ultra-processed whole grain breads and cereals. So they had less than 20 grams of sugar per 100 grams. It improves access or supports food security for many population groups. It also extends the shelf life of products, improving sustainability and reducing food waste as well. And of course, there's so many other factors that go into or to consider for food processing and sustainability. But that reduction of food waste is a major one. And then some quick fire off ones. So, and it's kind of things we've spoken about already as well, but I will summarize. So we have greater access. We've got greater food safety. So we can, during processing, kill harmful microorganisms and reduce food spoilage. We have, particularly in the context of whole grain foods, greater nutrient bioavailability and digestibility of these nutrients. We have increased convenience, and this is particularly for good for people with different cooking abilities and busy lifestyles as well. And then we have sensory properties as well. So trying to increase the acceptability of whole grain foods as well, and looking at that, swapping between refined grains and whole grains, and how can we, I know when I work in clinic, a lot of people are hesitant to swap to type wholemeal or whole grain types of breads, for example, because they know and they're familiar with refined grains, and they've usually got a little bit more sugar than whole grain types, so they are a little bit tastier and that kind of thing as well. So just some things to think about. My summary slide here. I haven't summarized the limitations per se, but I'm hoping that as we've discussed them throughout, that they've kind of become a little bit obvious. So things like we've got limitations in the justification for why these foods are considered ultra processed. We've got limitations in the evidence, limitations in terms of the differences in diet quality between ultra processed and whole grain foods, and so forth. So my summary is more around the bigger picture, I guess. So very much advocating for the promotion of all whole grain foods. Maybe we prioritize those lesser processed types, but definitely based on the evidence at the moment, those more ultra processed types particularly placing our diet for everyone, I would say, but also particularly for vulnerable groups, as well as considering things like cost, food security, and cooking abilities that we've just spoken about. Going forward and in this space, I guess, where I was talking earlier about there's more data coming out on things like food texture and eating rates, so more randomized controlled trial data, so better quality data, especially looking at that ultra processed food, like the subgroup level, so differentiating the foods within that UPF category, because we know how different sugar sweetened beverages are to our whole grain foods that are within that group. And we know that also looking at their associations with health too. And this way we can start to understand exact associations and potential mechanisms. Because we do have such different foods within that group as well, they're likely to have very different mechanisms of how processing impacts them and then impacts our health as well. I will say on this point too, industry engagement would probably be quite important here. At the moment, we don't, at least to my knowledge in Australia, we don't really have data on our food additives and things like emulsifiers and things like that. So we need to be working with industry to get this data, to do this research and to better understand the situation that's happening. We need consistent and accurate messaging to reflect the evidence. So I guess thinking about consumers and their understanding of whole grain foods and their processing, we first have our dietary guidelines that are saying, yes, these foods are great, consume such amounts of them, and make sure you're consuming at least half of your total grains of whole grains and so forth. But then if we have something, if we end up with messaging around Nova as well, it's very contradicting and confusing if we're then saying, no, reduce your intake of those foods because they're really highly processed. And then I would say at the moment, just educating consumers more on the processing of these foods and why it's important, why it's beneficial, and so forth. And then my last one there, which is again just bigger picture, we need coordinated efforts to develop, evaluate, and implement healthy dietary patterns that consider all aspects of nutrition. So I know we're focused on processing today, but I guess we know in its entirety, nutrition, like I guess nutrition science isn't a perfect science, and we've got all these different components of nutrition, like nutrients and processing, which is something we need to know about. We've then got things like sustainability as well there too. So we have all these different pathways happening, but trying to bring it together and understand what that means, bigger picture as well. And yeah, in promoting healthy dietary patterns. So yeah. Thank you. And I think I'm now maybe handing back to you, Kelly.
Yes, thank you so much. This was
No worries.
wonderful. So
I
maybe
will
if you want to
stop
stop
sharing now.
sharing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Before we open it up for question and answer, we're just going to go through three interactive poll questions here. So whether you are tuning in live or you're watching the recording, I encourage you to join us and quiz yourself. So our first question is, which of these foods would be considered ultra processed in the NOVA classification system? Would it be sliced 100% whole wheat sandwich bread, refined all-purpose flour, dried pasta made from 100% whole grain flour, seed oils, or beer? Okay, sharing the results now. So this is a really tricky one that trips people up, but the sandwich bread would be considered the ultra processed food. Okay, moving on to our next question. Which of these statements is false? People who eat more ultra-processed foods tend to be more likely to develop conditions like hypertension and diabetes. Whole grain foods are considered less processed than refined grain foods in the NOVA classification system, or a diet consisting of mostly ultra-processed foods can contain adequate amounts of most nutrients and have a high diet quality score. So two of these statements are true, one is false. I will share the results here. And yeah, most of you did get it right. The NOVA classification system, as Elissa shared with us, there's a lot of different components to it, and a lot of people don't realize that whole grains are not considered less processed in this system, even though, like, logically, we know that if you remove a bran and a germ, that is like more processing. So I'll stop sharing that. And then we have one more final poll question as part of your interactive assessment. So let me launch that for you. Which of these statements is false? Processing can make certain nutrients more bioavailable. Processing can lower the glycemic impact of a food. processing can improve shelf life, or the NOVA food classification system focuses on nutrients that are removed during processing, not ingredients that are added. All right, and yes, looks like most of y'all got this one right. So thank you. So I will stop sharing my screen, and it looks like we have just a couple minutes for question and answer. So maybe Elissa, if you want to take a look and see if there's any questions in the Q&A that you're interested in answering.
Yeah, of course. Sounds good. We've got one there that says, what are some potential implications of relying solely on the NOVA classification system for understanding whole grain foods? I'm hoping that was asked earlier on, so I'm hoping it got answered a little bit in the end there. But yeah, well, I think the one of the major implications that I would be worried about, and I'm probably more familiar with the Australian food context, but it's those nutrient intakes from fortification here. Um, it's perhaps, I guess, a little bit different in the US because you don't have that fortification of those whole grains, but we know there's still, regardless, a really dense natural containing amount of nutrients within fiber and nutrients within whole grain foods. So that would be my probably the greatest implication, I guess. We're probably also talking about if we're removing those foods from our diets, so whole grain breads and ready to eat cereals, for example, that are considered ultra processed, we're also probably removing a significant portion of people's intakes. And of course, this is context dependent on whether that's going to be concerning or not. But yeah, we get quite a bit of our energy from these foods, and which, yes, can be done in a good way because they are our body's main energy source, our carbohydrates. What else do we have there?
I think you made really good points in your presentation too about vulnerable populations being able to meet their
Yeah.
nutrient needs.
Yeah, so I think it's just, I guess, an important point, and nutrition has always been this, always been context dependent, and we individualize it to the person and that kind of thing. But if we have this broad recommendation to remove these foods, yeah, we're potentially causing some grief or guilt within communities or people who rely on those foods just for a bit of energy or nutrition. So let's have a look. What else? Someone asked, how did wheat flour, refined wheat flour become the norm? I think that's a little bit beyond me and my area. But they've then said it seems that this would be more difficult to process than whole wheat flour. To my understanding, and based on just conversations I've had with industry people as well, it can be a little bit more challenging to actually process whole wheat or whole grain flour because I think, to my understanding, what happens is it is the bran and the germ, or the flour is separated to produce that refined flour, but then we add those components back in to produce the whole wheat flour as well. I'm not sure if that's always the way that it's done, but there is that extra step there for whole wheat flour too. And to my understanding as well, that's why it can sometimes be a little bit more expensive than refined wheat varieties. But yeah, an interesting point made there as well.
We had
Just
a
scroll
webinar
down.
last week, if anyone's interested in watching the recording about the milling process. So that would
Yes.
be a good place to learn more about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say that it's not exactly I don't know a great deal about that side of things more so. My research or focus is more on the health association side of things. Someone said examples were perfect. example of why ultra-processed foods is not an effective way to assess, nutrient quality. And I guess that's an important thing to note as well, that the NOVA system, it wasn't developed to assess nutrient quality. Obviously, it was developed to try and categorize foods based on their level of processing. But as I said at the end there, food is so multifaceted. We have processing, we have sustainability, we have nutrients. So when we make recommendations on one, we've got to be cautious or considerate of what the implication is on the other, and need to find kind of a happy medium there somewhere as well. Is enriched wheat class 2? Yeah, so that's maybe my last, just looking at the clock, but my last point here as well in answering that one. Fortification or enrichment itself isn't considered a method of processing in NOVA, but what the foods that we fortify and enrich are typically those higher or ultra processed foods, and that's why we're kind of concerned with it there. So hopefully I've made that clear, that fortification isn't considered a way of processing, but it's obviously something that happens during the processing of those foods. So yes.
Thank you so much for your time, and we'll share the slides and the references list with you all afterwards, so that you can dig in more to this. It's really interesting to think about because, as Elissa pointed out, like refined flour and whole wheat flour are in the same NOVA classification system.
Yes.
Brown rice and white rice are in the same level. And so, I think it's a lot of people are surprised to hear that it's not more nutrition focused. But anyways, we could probably chat about this all day. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. So thank you. Goodbye, everyone.